Hello and welcome to Circle Passages and Higher Ground. Actually, I wouldn't say guests. We're all kind of co-hosts here, but would like to introduce you to Heather and Jordan, and I'm Buck. Thank you very much. I look forward to these meetings, just like all the other meetings that we have, or any of the other ones. It's always cool stuff that we end up talking about. And today it's kind of reviewing some of what really kind of got started, if you would, not to get it started, it's been happening, but in April of this year, where Governor Inslee declared a crisis for youth, students, with suicide attempts, suicide actually happening, and a whole host of other self-harm kinds of activities. So what I'd like to do, if we can, is to kind of start with that. And, unfortunately, the numbers haven't gone down. Some of this related to, and I think that's what they were trying to do earlier this year, relating that to the pandemic. But a lot of this already existed. And unfortunately, it's not going down. If anything, it's been pretty steady, if not maybe a rise in some instances. So it's really for us to kind of talk about that today, and kind of also talk about something that we did last week as a way to maybe kind of help out with resolving some of that. But any thoughts about the, again, those numbers, and then crisis earlier this year? We're still in crisis, it seems, with youth.
Well, I guess the statistics have been humanized for me in terms of seeing and encountering people in the community that are in crisis and who have either had a loved one attempt or be successful at suicide, or have suicidal ideation themselves. So one of the things, in a way, for people with children, it's pretty easy to see it as someone that's a loved one, but sometimes when we see the statistics, especially if they're national statistics, it can seem really abstract and remote. But when you begin to encounter people and you get to see the details of their lives, and just is all of the issues that we've had perennially, from domestic abuse and violence, sexual assault, social emotional abuse, all of the different things. Now we have a lot of stress around economics too. But some of the new stressors that I see that I think are compounding these issues are concern about their education, concern about their lack of education in a sense, or preparedness for either going on to college or continuing in high school. Stress and anxiety around going back to school because it's been so disrupted. And so, a lot of things maybe that people wouldn't think about or haven't thought about enough, but that are really preoccupying and weighing upon youth. Again, whether they're going to high school or college. And so for me, I guess the statistics have always been bad and are getting worse. But it's personalizing it and encountering people that are the lived statistics has made an impression on me, where it just seems that much more dire because they're real people to help.
Definitely. So it's not like it's just out there somewhere,
no,
right?
It's all around us, in ways that are not obvious. As we've talked about, sometimes people who even seem happy are compensating. So some of the people that seem okay are really not okay.
We were talking earlier too with the pandemic and not homeschooling, but virtual schooling, and how that meets some percentage of the student population. They just struggle with the social piece, so that works for them. But it's a lot of the others where you take that social piece away, and that's pretty significant. And depending on what the parents are doing as far as this lockdown already that was going on last year. It's kind of coming back again with this new surge, but it just is a recipe for disaster, it seems, and unfortunately we're seeing some of that, like you said, locally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing too about the school and being at home and the isolation and, you know, the factor, you know, it all makes sense in terms of, you know, we all had to deal with COVID and people being inside, but I would almost venture to say, and, you know, nothing's black and white, but I would almost venture to say that it doesn't really work for any of the kids. Even in a short term, if they're able to keep grades, like I know a lot of people where school was a lot easier when it was online for the most part. There are a lot of teachers that were ill prepared to actually take everything online. So even in the kids where, but they're still getting decent grades, I think the long-term effects of the social isolation, you know, like I think it's really key, Mom, touching on how it is affected and affects other issues, domestic violence, you know, keeping every member of the house in the home is I think there are a lot of families, kids and parents who have struggled with the new home dynamics that, you know, are created by people constantly being at home all day. They're frustrated. They're frustrated economically, you know, like all the things that you touched on. The kids are stressed about school. You know, they don't understand what's going on. Big picture too, like I said, long term, you know, they're stressed about climate change. Is there going to be a world for them and their children and their grandchildren? I just think all these stressors are playing on people where even in a short term, if it feels like it's kind of working, to me, and maybe it's because as I do more of this kind of work, I interact with more people who are struggling, and people are more willing to tell you that they're struggling. Like you said, people call mental health, it's almost like the silent killer, right? Because you just don't know. I mean, I know when I struggled, I knew I was compensating. I did a lot of things that seemed like, oh, he's happy and he's outgoing, and maybe I was outgoing, but I definitely wasn't happy at all. And so I just think all those things play in where it's just not a long-term solution that works. Even if it feels like it's working a little bit for some people, I just really don't think that this model that we have is, you know, especially with the pandemic making everything worse, it's just not working. And you know, I don't say that because I like it. It's something that we just need to work on. But I think, you know, and obviously something that we're going to touch on in a little bit is, I think the biggest problem is we just don't grow the skills to cope with these sort of things. We don't focus on mental health, and so it's almost like we're at the tipping point where, and you know, the pandemic was bigger than most people anticipated almost anything could be, but I just feel like we're at that moment where it's like we're ready to be pushed beyond, you know, without these skills to actually cope. I feel like we're just ready to be pushed into this dark place. It's like, you know, we don't have the skills, so as soon as something happens, especially something as big in scope as the pandemic, it's like, you know, everything falls apart, and it's almost like, you know, we're the house of cards that's just like ready to fall apart constantly because we, you know, to continue the metaphor, we just haven't developed the skills that are like the foundation to keep us up. And so, you know, one of the things we'll keep talking about, I'm sure, throughout today and lots of days, but it's really that lack of skills, and not just to cope, but to thrive. What does it look like to, you know, what does it mean to be prosperous on our trip? I'm talking a lot here, but on our trip we just did, the rite of passage we just did, I was driving there with my grandpa, and I used the word prosper, and, you know, and it's we just sort of kind of talked through it, but he was like, you know, what does prosper to mean? And to me, that doesn't mean monetarily at all. Like, what does it look like to really prosper? And how do we grow the skills so that we are capable of prospering or, you know, working through things even when they're difficult? And that for me is like the real crisis. Is we have all these, it's like, you know, the duality of we have more issues than we've ever dealt with as people, and we have less skills to actually deal with them, I think, than we've almost ever had. And, you know, so many are needed now. So it's like the issue being so bad and us having the inability to really deal with it is just it's compounding to this point now where it's just mind-blowing. And like the last thing I'll say is seeing the actual people, humanizing it. I worked soccer camps with kids every year, and this was the first time at a camp, and I'm sure it's happened to a lot of kids. There are a lot of kids I've talked to about mental health, but this last year was one of the first times where, and obviously I'd never say any names or anything like that, but a girl who was there was like basically, you know, like had, I don't even want to call it a breakdown because that feels unfair to her, but she was just really struggling with mental health in a way where it was like she needed help right then, and her life at home wasn't so good. And again, I don't need to get into all of it, but it's those experiences that, because you could hear the statistics, and we know the statistics are bad, but it's when you meet the people where you're just like, you know, it's like the expression, it's like you could hear about the statistics of war, but it's like when you watch the people suffer and you see them there, you know, in the worst of conditions, it touches you more than if you just read about them on a sheet. And so, yeah, I just agree. The more and more maybe I get involved with this, you just see it, and it's so heartbreaking. It makes you like, why are we not doing more? It almost gets you frustrated because some kids nowadays are so young. It's like, how could they have these skills? And the fact that they're thinking about such big issues is just, it feels unfair to them. So yeah, it gets you passionate, but it's also like, we just got to do something about it, and we need to grow these skills more.
You know, it seems historically in this country, and unfortunately, like European countries, like vacation sort of things, it's mandatory. You know, 8 weeks, let's say. You know, get away and relax. The mental health aspect, we put that on the back burner, but it's unfortunately the symptoms and all the things that are taking place is right out there, out front. But we seem to, well, we've got some other things where the prioritizing takes place, the focusing seems to, and I think we do a pretty poor job with attending to the mental health issues. And, you know, we keep hearing about it, keep seeing it, like you said, statistics, but the pressures, and like you said, how, especially for youth, of not feeling prepared enough to go to that next level, even if it's the next grade. But if you're going into college, and like talk about a foundation, it's pretty shaky. You know, it's kind of like more built on sand rather than something solid. So it's kind of like, when are we going to get it here, folks, to start taking care of business? Because it's the youth that obviously, eventually, that's who our leaders are going to be, right? Seeing more and more of youth stepping up, like this last vote, absolutely. But again, you know, more focus on the other aspects, you know, the economy, all these other things, very important. Obviously, the climate's very important, but that's the stuff that's impacting youth too. They're not just, they don't have their heads under the sand, right? It's concerning.
Ecological grief and the burden of that, you know, not only are the youth going to live through that, but more children are not having children, more young people are not having children. And I was reading an article, and it was making the distinction that people in the past who had an ecological mindset might choose to not have a child to overburden the world, but now youth or young people are not having children because they don't believe their children would have a life, or, you know, they believe they would suffer, and they don't believe that it's a habitable, you know, sustainable planet. And that is just kind of almost unfathomable. It transcends our ability to cope. And so psychological resilience for ecological grief, and you know, a lot of the different things that are inherent in what we do are helping them hold that, you know, to foster resilience so that they can cope and grow those skills, you know. And the foundation is really mental health. You know, if we don't have a foundation of mental health, we kind of have no foundation. And that's the part that I always think we're lagging behind. You know, we prioritize physical health, but we're still, in terms of funding and understanding, we're still lagging behind in terms of how essential mental health is.
Yeah, it's like, you know, I can only speak from my own experience, but we all probably feel this way. There are days where, you know, you're struggling with things, and it just, everything you do throughout the day feels difficult. You know, I've got to do laundry, now I've got to fold my laundry, and everything just feels like it takes so much energy. And on the flip side of the coin, you have days where you know, maybe because you've been eating well or whatever it is, you just feel like you can do it all. Like, oh, I'm just on to the next thing, and I just feel like I just got so many things done today. And it's a microcosm for almost what we need big picture with our world. It's like trying to solve all these massive problems in the world when all of us are struggling with so many things that we're functioning at like 50%. And, you know, there's that whole, we only use 10% of our brain. So maybe it's not even 50%. But numbers aside, I think it's that, you know, exactly like my mom is saying, it's once we solve and we try and get at least, even if we're just more on top of it than we are, we may never actually arrive and get there till, you know, people are always going to struggle with things. There's always going to be tough things throughout life. But once we're on top of it and we, like I say, grow these skills, I know that's a generic term, but we're able to foster resilience and all these other things, I think the issues that our world is going to have to deal with, like climate change, become, even if they're still so daunting, they become more doable. They become more realistic for us to actually take on, where, you know, if we're all functioning at 30, 50, whatever percent it is, it's like, it's going to be so much harder to actually deal with these issues. It's like we need to get to the point where everybody's feeling capable, both in their own lives and as a community, big picture. And I'm not saying put off climate change like that. It all needs to happen simultaneously, but it's almost like, you know, trying to, I play sports, so I could just use a sports metaphor because it helps me frame it. It's like, you know, you're not going to win the biggest game of your life if, you know, you haven't been drinking water and you haven't been, you know, you ate a bunch of cake the night before, or, you know, use whatever metaphor you want. But if you're ill prepared for the task and you don't have the prep and the resilience and all the other things that are necessary to actually take the task on, you're just going to get crushed by it. And I just think that's what's happening in our world, is we're just getting crushed by these massive monumental tasks that are going to be difficult for us regardless of circumstance. And we're going into them so ill-prepared, you know, like we're about to run a marathon and we haven't been drinking water for the last couple of days. It's just like, well, yeah, it's going to go super poorly. Like, of course it is. And so I think that's exactly the way I frame it in my head is, you know, we need to focus more on these things, not because, oh, like we need to spend our time on mental health and divert time towards that. It's going to give us more energy so that we can do everything else. And so we're not getting crushed emotionally and physically by every single thing we come across, which it just feels like that's what's happening now. It just feels like all these tasks feel impossible because we haven't even done the prep to address them the way we should. It's just sad.
And I'm going to go on a positive note.
Yeah, do it. All of it can can be done. We just got to put a little bit more energy into it, and all of those are doable tasks. Sorry, I'm not trying to be depressing.
That was our doom and gloom beginning.
Oh, spur you to action. Yeah.
But I'm also, on the other hand, I'm also reassured and kind of astonished sometimes with how little help can help people, you know, look at and confront and begin to prepare for big life tasks and challenges. That it doesn't, on some level, take a lot, and in some cases, it's just being able to talk about it. 'Cause that's one of the other things, is I think we have a culture of silence and denial around not just climate change, maybe, but just we don't talk about hard things. And I get it on one hand, but then you need some place to be able to do that. And so time and again, I've actually been really affirmed and surprised by how little, if you just can help people provide a container and provide some basic skills, that we also can self-regulate pretty quickly to a much more capable situation. So there's hope for the world.
And to address that, and that's the part that it seems like the black hole that we have fallen into since this pandemic, and trying to figure it out. Everybody's looking for the finish line. When's this thing going to be over so we can get back to whatever normal is? But like you said, both of you, it's the skills that are those taking place. Like, this is going to be big stuff, going back to school again, being back in the classroom for teachers, for students, for parents, you know, is the safety aspect of it. And somewhere in here, you know, hopefully have some trust that let's make this work. How can we make this work? Because it seems like that will help us like you mentioned, just even with a little bit of time addressing, you're providing some hope, you're providing some concrete skills, the coping mechanisms to take on whatever is coming down the pike here, because these next couple of months are going to be very interesting with the transition back to school again. And we've talked about this before too, how it's very significant where moms have had to kind of take the back seat of, being in the family, but as far as their own careers, let's say, or being out there in the world, it's like had to back off, and that's pretty significant, how much it's meant to them, and then really so many other aspects that trickle down, isn't it, because of that taking place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or sorry.
No.
I was just going to say, that's why I think, like you said earlier, Mom, that the touching on how it affects all these other issues, domestically within the home, I think is so key, because it's, like you just said, obviously it's meant to educate our children and foster learning and all sorts of other things. Just to, say it objectively, one of the things school is also is it's a place that your kids can go. It's like a free daycare for your parents,
right.
Amongst, obviously, like that's why I gave the preface, amongst all the other beautiful things that our teachers do. And I'm not trying to belittle it at all, but like you just said, there are so many parents over the last year or two that have had to totally change the way that they function. And some jobs can be done remotely from home, but not all of them can. And a lot of people had to struggle, even if your job can be done remotely from home, your kid is now in your house and they're going to class for a couple hours throughout the day, but they require attention, and especially younger kids. You can't just leave a 7-year-old on their own all day to do whatever they want. That's just not the way it works. So yeah, I think it's how all the issues interweave around with COVID and climate change and everything into mental health, I think is so much of the key, because you can't just be like, oh, well, it's just about this specific thing. Everything plays a factor. And I know that makes it, again, feel like a daunting task, but it doesn't have to be daunting. It's more just seeing the connections of how all these things impact one another so that we can work towards a solution that is, well-rounded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think too, besides the rites of passage that are more intensive, like what we just did, the circle work and restoring right relationship within families, because domestic violence is up and divorces, and for some people, if you're harmonious, it's been great. But for a lot of people, it's really just all of these just kind of perfect storm of circumstances have made it really hard, where people do need that container of the whole family, like talking things through and restoring relationships. And so also including parents and children, not just children, and for adults too, so that some of these offerings are for adults who have suffered as well, maybe more stoically, but who have also suffered through the pandemic.
Everybody's been affected, right? From little ones to grown-ups, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, well, in almost like this zone of, so how do we navigate this? How do we work through it? And I thought with what we did this past week, a vision quest through part of Rites of Passage, just phenomenal. And you mentioned something a little while ago. Obviously, we were on the beach and seeing families where 2 or 3 little ones, and when I'm seeing this, and you see the parents, it's wow, that's they're pretty close in age too. Looks like, I don't know, say 3 to maybe 6, but what lies ahead, What's so cool that here they are checking out the beach and the wilderness. Fabulous stuff. But it was really what what we did as far as the vision quest went. That was really super too. So these were adults, obviously still have concerns, stuff going on, is working through those things. And here are some, I think, what we were offering is that ability, the container, the holding them in that place of helping them work through. How can you do that? You know, what is it that you, and I think by the end of the week, okay, I've got a few more things in my tool belt, let's say, that I can use now. And that was just super, wasn't it, to see that happen?
Yeah, I think, you know, like you said something earlier, Mom, where sometimes, whether it's for kids or adults or people who are struggling, a lot of times this might not be the entire solution, but one of the first steps is just to talk about it, just to actually have a real talk about it where you're not holding anything back and you're not worried what they're going to think about this thing. You're actually just really talking about it. And I think, you know, when we were out on the Rite of Passage last week, that's one of the things that maybe we all said, or said by everybody, but was sometimes you don't even really know what the issue is. Sometimes you don't even really know, you know, what you want in life, or what you're, you know, we're out there trying to claim the new you on the Rite of Passage, and sometimes you don't even know what that looks like. But part of it is because of, you know, the way that say our society, but I think just the way people are built, where people don't want to share really intimate parts of themselves, like we've been saying, and, you know, they get insecure about what other people are going to think and all that. And so part of it is just giving people the space, like we're saying, you know, it's one of the beautiful parts about the Rite of Passage is holding this container where people can just actually figure that out almost, you know, sometimes it's even just them talking for a couple of minutes on their own and with no mirroring from anybody else or input from everybody else. Obviously, we give that input too, but sometimes you can literally watch somebody just talk for a couple of minutes, and by the end, they've like formulated what they really think or what they want in life or what their problems are and how to solve them. And, you know, you can almost see in those moments, it's like, man, they've maybe done it in their own head, but they've never been afforded a space where they could actually just think about this, like out loud. Because part of the problem is a lot of these things, you know, when we're dealing with mental health or whatever it is, these issues, we think about them in our head, but, you know, and that's one of the things that I think is really valuable when I talk about skills, but like the way you talk to yourself in your head is so interesting. It's really fascinating the way people, both in a positive and in a negative light, the way people talk to themselves in their head. So, because you can, you know, you can just get yourself convinced, totally convinced about something that's totally false, or judge yourself for something and all that. So part of it is just having a space with other people where you can just talk about things. And I know even, you know, I do this all the time when I sit in space and I talk to people about some of the ways that I think about myself or the ways I think about things. I have people all the time just be like, oh my gosh, that's so stressful. Like, why do you frame it that way? Like, that's just totally not the way we see it at all. And, you know, it sounds funny, but it is so satisfying isn't even the right word. It's like reaffirming of yourself. It's like, man, I had all these negative opinions or all these things that I'm kind of framing in a negative light about myself or the world, and you vocalize them and people are like, oh yeah, you know, it's okay. Like, it's not as big a deal as you're making it out to be, or maybe it is, but like the way you're framing it isn't helping yourself, it's hurting yourself. And so part of it is just like we do, you know, on the Rite of Passage, but it's also, you know, just connecting it. It's one of the main solutions to all this is people just need to be able to talk about what is bothering them. And it's so interesting to me. I meet a lot of young people nowadays, and I talk to them about stuff like this, and it's like people think therapy. It's like anytime you're talking with other people about things that are bothering you or you're struggling with in your life, it's like, what is this, a freaking therapy lesson? It's like, why is it therapy for us to just like actually put energy into like trying to better ourselves? It's just interesting to me, but I think all that comes out of a lot of people, mostly insecurity, is people don't want to talk to other people about their issues, and other people, you know, it's almost like nobody wants to talk about it because then it's like, oh, but then my issues are going to come up. And more and more in life, sorry, I keep just going on tangents talking, but more and more it's just those issues are like the path to prosperity. That's one of the easy ways when I encourage people to do this, and maybe not everybody even views it this way, but the things that bother you or the issues that you have, either about yourself or about the world, working through those is the path to prosperity. I truly believe that. So it's almost like those things about you that you don't want other people to hear, working through those is the way to be happy. At least in my experience. In my experience, it truly is. It's like all the things about myself that I didn't want other people to know, just telling other people and being like, I'm trying to be better about this. Like, help me. Maybe sometimes you just even need to say, help me. I can't do this on my own. But all that, the inability or the not wanting to do that is just us being in our own heads. And so I think one of the beautiful parts about it, like I keep saying, is just give people a space where they can just talk, and nobody's going to judge them, and everybody's going to support them. Even if what they're saying is crazy, you're just going to be like, okay, let's talk about that. And you just mirror them. And for a lot of people, that's why it's so mind-blowing, I think, for us, and it's so beautiful, is there are so many people who have literally never had that. They've just never had anybody allow them to share everything that they're thinking. And yeah, it's just beautiful. It's like you watch people transform in like 2 hours, the whole way they feel about themselves. And it's not perfect and permanent, but it's a huge step, and I just don't think people are willing to talk. And I don't know, it's just fascinating to me, because it's like we're hurting ourselves by not talking about the things that are hurting ourselves. It's just this weird paradox, but it's a lot of words. But it's funny, it's just interesting to see.
Yeah, I do think so much of it is creating a safe container, and then that mirroring where people see and are seen. And the vulnerability you were talking about, Jord, they've correlated it with success, but it's almost like it's counterintuitive, because to be vulnerable seems like we could be wounded, which, therapy is just from the root healing, but we don't want to admit that we have wounds or that we've been hurt, but of course everybody has been. So that vulnerability is really essential to healing, and it actually is, there are all those quotes, Rumi, the wound is where the light enters, or different variations of that, but when we open up with our vulnerability, that's when we can connect to each other on a deep level. And so that's a lot of what the rite of passage is people are so thirsty for that kind of deep connection and vulnerability, because they haven't had that kind of safe container provided for them. So on some level, it's really simple, but it's really essential.
And just tremendous, being in circle, so a group of us, and everybody kind of in agreement of honoring what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're saying, and like you said, at some point mirroring that, so somebody, not only do I see you, but I hear you, I'm listening. That was just, it is enormous. It's very powerful, isn't it? And see that especially with youth, where, and again, this past year, it's been so scattered. Yeah, we're doing it online, and they're so good about a lot of social media stuff and being online, but then that isolation takes place, is getting back into, and I'm doing this because it is in circle, and it just, what a wonderful way to, let me share, let me get these things out. And like you said, Jordan, within moments, you can see the person just kind of relaxing a little bit more, and finally getting it out there. And it's not up here; it's finally coming out. Just tremendous way to do it, and I think it's what we're talking about too. Is what we're trying to offer on different levels, different ages, and individuals. Like you said, the family piece, enormous right there, and certainly the group work. So. Looking forward to us continuing. That was a great kickoff that we had last weekend.
Yeah, and the ability to drop deep in family is really great, because then you have that depth that you can go to again, because so much of what we probably all hear is, I've never been able to tell anyone or talk to anyone about that, or often parents, because they want to reaffirm the positive, it can feel dismissive because they're wanting to be upbeat or whatever. So that's a positive instinct, but on some level, youth especially maybe just need to be heard. But if you can do that in groups, so that the youth have a peer group of support, and in families, so that they can have a family, then you can allow people to go back to that level of depth because you've experienced it before, and also to create a safe container and to know what essentially the rules are, which are really simple in terms of creating a safe container, but so they can transfer that to their home environment. So
That's a huge step sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
A big leap. And like you said, for the parents to, let's just kind of move on, but are you really listening to what your child or your children are saying?
Right, and I think people just don't even know. Like, we talk to each other, but I don't think we know how things come across. I think people are well-intentioned, but they don't realize what the effect is sometimes of what they say.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I recall in group with teens and would at some point say, do you see what's going on here? The sharing that we're doing, the support that you give one another. So how do we take it from right here out there? And that's the community and certainly at home. And that's where it's so important, including the parents, say individually or as the parents first, but then family, of how we can all get on that same page that we're always hoping for.
Right.
And just for the communication to happen. And these are the seeds, I think, that we plant, and hopefully we see those flourish.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't it interesting that, so many people it's like you struggle the most almost, or strangers I bet too, but with the people being, vulnerable with the people in your own home. It's so many people. It's like home where it's supposed to be only people who support you. Your support structure is built around your home and everybody's there for you. And yet so many people, both kids to parents and vice versa probably, struggle just speaking authentically and with the barriers down even to their closest loved ones. So I don't have an answer for that. I wish I had this is how you do it. Part of it is just courage, but I say this all the time. It's like strength through vulnerability. We have this fundamental idea in our society that being vulnerable is weakness, and the shields that keep you from being vulnerable that we all put up are strength. And I just think it's absolutely flipped. It's the exact opposite. Those, vulnerability takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of strength to tell people, especially like we're talking about the dynamics between kids and parents. Your parents want to believe that everything's going to go great for you, and so to tell your parents that it's not what they want to hear. Yeah. And it's not that they're going to be angry about you at you, but it's not what they want to hear. And to tell somebody something that they don't want to hear, I mean, who likes telling somebody something that they don't want to hear? Nobody does. That sucks, unless you really hate the person. And so, which hopefully in your home dynamic you don't really hate the person, but still it's so interesting that we struggle to be vulnerable and to really tell them what we think. And then, I don't need to go on a tangent about it again, but on the flip side, it's those barriers that we put up to keep from being vulnerable. We think that's what makes us strong. And it's what holds us back from being strong. Those things, oh no, it's okay, I'm just gonna push through another day. I can push through another day and I don't need to talk to them about this right now. It's we think that we're pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, but that's insecurity. And not just from you, maybe from them also, but working through that is how you become, that's how you grow strength. And I think that fundamental misunderstanding to what being vulnerable really means and why it's important and why it's part of the reason that we don't hold, in our society, there's not a lot of spaces where you could just talk about things, because we don't provide people the opportunity to just be vulnerable. And I don't know, it's just so fascinating to me that, you talk to kids and they say stuff like, I've never been able to say this to somebody before, and it's hard, the fact that you can't talk to your parents. To sit and have something that you're struggling with and that your parents would probably even want to help you with, but you just, maybe they're resistant to hear it, and so you don't really want to emphasize it, so you never really tell them how bad it really is. And then the issue just gets worse and worse where, people just got to throw that, I'm not saying there's not a time to, pull yourself up and go at it hard like that. Absolutely, there's times for you to figure it out and just try and do it. But man, asking for help is not a bad thing, and being vulnerable is not a bad thing. And I just think the way that part of the reasons these systems don't exist is because we just have this fundamental misunderstanding to what it means to actually share your weaknesses. And that's why nobody wants to share them, because I think they're just worried about judgment. And things being used against them. And I don't know, it's part of the reason I think it's tough with people at home is because they know you so well. They know you so well, and you worry, what if next time I argue with them, they're going to use this, if I share this weakness, what if they're going to use it against me? And yeah, I think there needs to be a willingness to just say the thing. And if they're the type of person that uses your weaknesses against you, maybe they're not, maybe they're not the support structure you need. But yeah, it's, like we talk about building these skills. One of them is a huge one that I can just speak for myself that's been so beneficial for me is what's your support structure look like? And the first one, there's all sorts of things, meditation and stuff, but the first one is people. What does your support structure look like with people? Who can you talk to? And if there's nobody you can talk to about anything, find the closest person and just start, I don't know, maybe don't just start sharing, but you need to start building that. Building that support structure is like, like we were talking about at the start, and again, I don't mean to be doom and gloom. If we do these things, I believe so deeply in human potential, but it's like, you don't have anybody you can talk to about your bad day, you're going to have more bad days. That's just rough, and I don't condemn you to that, but the support structure is it's everything. And the fact that there are so many kids, especially, who just feel like they can't talk to anybody. That's what I said earlier. Like it's like we're constantly ready for disaster because we're just standing at the edge of the cliff, and it's like, we need support and different things to make it so, when something really bad happens, we don't just fall right on our face or, fall to the depths or whatever that looks like metaphorically.
And that's where that circle work, again, I think to build some of those skills, acquire some of those skills, and hopefully, like you said, it's awkward where I'm reticent to talk to my parents about something. Maybe have the confidence to do that, the courage, like you're talking about.
Yeah, and to establish like family, we had some family meetings or family circles. Part of it's self-regulation, but part of it's regulation as a family and a community. And one of the things to what Jordan's saying that I've heard, which is that up against a cliff, is people saying, I can't handle it anymore. But then the danger is that people have let it go till it's just such a crisis. Yeah. And if we could tell people and kind of let the pressure valve off a little bit sooner, people wouldn't be at risk for, the suicide or the overdose or the, mental health crisis. A lot of people can't get out of cycles of anxiety right now. So if we could just take that action a little bit sooner so we don't get to the breaking point, because so often people, I've heard this over and over, I can't handle it anymore. And it's like, so then it's really good they're in there, but then it's like, if we could just do that a little bit sooner, it would be way safer for everybody. Definitely. And that's where, whatever that looks like, to have those systems of support. And, as a last note, we're going back to school, and I know there's always a influx of people and referrals from mental health practitioners, and now it's going to be really high, but to create some system of checks and balances so people have someone to go to, especially if their home environment isn't conducive to talking. The outlets, that would be lovely.
And actually, fortunately, I believe that's what we're putting together, some proposals to offer those kinds of services, and we're one of hopefully a number of other kinds of entities, agencies that will help with that transition. It's going to be a huge one, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, as a final thought, I know we're closing up, but the last time I met with the person who took us on the rite of passage, we went on, Larry Hobbs, a fantastic human being. But we talked about, things I struggle with and things he struggled with, and one of the main things that we were saying at the end of the conversation is so much of it is about catching it, early. And to me, it's just, figuring out that, even if it's just in that day, catching, the things that get you spiraling in a negative way early. And it just reminds me of, I say this all the time, we as this, I keep saying we as a society, but people in general, people like treatment. Prevention is harder. Prevention takes more time. Prevention takes, but prevention is really the answer in almost across the board. Now, if you've got a problem, you need to treat it, but typically, before it gets so bad, like we're saying, there are steps that can be taken to keep it from ever getting to a point where now it's a crisis. You know, part of the reason, like we're saying, and I'm kind of just echoing you, is part of the reason we're in crisis is we were supposed to be taking steps years ago. And part of what that says to me as a lesson going forward is, you know, just because, you know, it's like, don't wait till we're in crisis to do something about it. If you're talking to your child and they seem like they're doing really well, and you know, share things openly and all that, and not like I'm telling people what to do, but that's perfect. You know, keep going. It's like, let's try and be better about not waiting until we're actually in the ultimate crisis before doing something. You know, how can we just, you know, basically it's not just the parents whose kids are struggling who should go talk to their kids about this stuff. It's everybody should. Everybody should, and those are the preventative steps so that it never gets so bad. Because, you know, if we let it get so bad, the chances of something really, really, you know, something drastically bad happening just shoot up exponentially. So, you know, let's catch it early. And it's not, you know, it's just a little bit of talking.
Definitely. Well, that sets the tone for our next meeting and discussion. But thank you both. This was, again, it's always fabulous.
Yeah.
Thank you, Beck.
Yeah,
It's always
thank you.
great.
Yeah, it
You're
really
welcome.
is.
You're welcome. And thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time.